Imagine Boston in the year 1773. The streets were made of cobblestones and the air smelled of salt from the nearby sea. Horses pulled carriages and men in three-cornered hats hurried along, talking about the news of the day. Boston was a busy town in the American colonies, a place full of merchants, sailors and families. But under the surface of this bustling city, a feeling of deep unhappiness was starting to bubble up, much like water getting ready to boil for tea. The people living there were British subjects, loyal to a king who lived an entire ocean away in England. They were proud of their connection to Britain, but they were also proud of their lives in America and the freedoms they had built for themselves. The big problem was all about money and fairness, and it centered on a simple beloved drink tea. The British government, led by King George III, needed money. Fighting wars was very expensive, and Britain felt the American colonies should help pay for the costs of their own protection. To raise this money, Parliament passed laws that placed taxes on many goods sent to the colonies. One of these was the Tea Act of 1773. This law wasn't just about making tea more expensive, it was about control. It gave a single British company, the East India Company, the sole right to sell tea in the colonies. This meant colonial merchants couldn't sell their own tea and were being pushed out of business by a faraway government. The colonists felt this was terribly unfair. They had a saying that became their rallying cry: "No taxation without representation." What did this mean? It meant they believed it was wrong for the British Parliament to tax them when they had no elected representatives in that Parliament to speak for them. It was like having rules made for your house by someone who had never visited and didn't have to live by them. To the colonists, drinking the taxed tea was like swallowing a spoonful of British control. They weren't just angry about the price of a cup of tea, they were angry about losing their voice and their freedom to make their own choices in their own land. This growing anger created a tense atmosphere across Boston. Town meetings were held where fiery speakers like Samuel Adams stood up and stirred the crowds with powerful words. He and others, known as the Sons of Liberty, argued that they had to take a stand. They couldn't just sit back and let the King and Parliament walk all over their rights. When 3 ships loaded with East India Company tea, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor and the Beaver, sailed into Boston Harbor, the tension reached its peak. The colonists had to decide what to do. Would they let the tea be unloaded and sold, or would they do something bold to stop it? The deadline was approaching. The Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson was determined that the tea would be unloaded and the tax would be paid. He refused to allow the ships to sail back to England with their cargo. For the Sons of Liberty and many other Bostonians, this was the final straw. On the cold, dark night of December 16th, 1773, a plan was put into action. A huge crowd gathered at the Old South Meeting House, listening to passionate speeches that filled the air with energy and defiance. As the meeting ended, a signal was given. It was time. A group of men, maybe 100 or more, prepared to do something that would be remembered for centuries. To protect their identities and make a symbolic statement, the men disguised themselves. They darkened their faces with soot and grime and wrapped blankets around their shoulders. They stuck feathers in their hair, dressing up as Mohawk warriors. This was not to blame Native Americans for what they were about to do, rather it was a symbol. At the time, the image of the Native American represented a spirit of freedom and a distinctly American identity, separate from the British. Dressed in their disguises, these men marched silently and purposefully through the dark streets of Boston, heading straight for Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 tea ships were quietly bobbing in the water. Once they reached the wharf, the men split into 3 groups, 1 for each ship. They were organized and moved with surprising quietness, climbing aboard the Dartmouth, the Eleanor and the Beaver. The ship crews, taken by surprise, offered no resistance. The men demanded the keys to the cargo holds, and the sailors, seeing the determined looks on their faces, quickly handed them over. The protesters then went to work with axes and hatchets, breaking open the heavy wooden chest that held the precious tea. The sound of splintering wood echoed softly across the dark water as they began their protest in earnest. For the next 3 hours, the men worked tirelessly. They hoisted the heavy chests, each weighing hundreds of pounds, from the holds onto the decks of the ships. With mighty heaves, they smashed the chests open and dumped their contents over the sides. A total of 342 chests of tea were thrown into the chilly waters of Boston Harbor. The tea leaves floated on the surface, turning the harbor into what some called the world's largest teapot. The men were careful not to damage anything else on the ships or to steal any of the tea for themselves. This wasn't a riot for personal gain, it was a focused political protest meant to send a clear message. The act of destroying the tea was deeply symbolic. Tea was more than just a popular drink in the 18th century. It was a powerful symbol of British culture and commerce. By throwing it into the harbour, the colonists were not just rejecting a tax, they were rejecting British authority and control over their lives. It was a dramatic and defiant gesture that could not be ignored. They were essentially saying that they would rather see the valuable cargo at the bottom of the sea than submit to what they saw as tyranny. The destruction of private property was a radical step, showing just how far the colonists were willing to go to defend their principles of liberty and self-governance. The protest was remarkably orderly, which made its message even stronger. The participants, the Sons of Liberty, made sure that their actions were targeted and specific. They harmed no one and damaged nothing but the tea itself. One story even tells of how they found a padlock that one of the ship's captains had broken, and they replaced it the next day. This discipline showed that their actions were not a mindless, angry mob's rampage. Instead, it was a calculated political statement, a carefully planned act of civil disobedience designed to communicate their profound disagreement with British policy. Their message was clear. We are not lawless rebels, but principled citizens fighting for our rights. News of the Boston Tea Party spread like wildfire throughout the American colonies. While some, like Benjamin Franklin, thought destroying property was a step too far, many others were inspired by the boldness of the Boston Patriots. The event became a rallying point, a shared story of defiance that united colonists from New Hampshire to Georgia. People in other towns held their own smaller tea parties, either by burning tea or sending ships back to England. The Boston Tea Party transformed the abstract argument over taxation into a concrete, heroic event. It gave people a powerful symbol to rally around and strengthened the sense of a common American cause against a common oppressor. For Britain, the news was received not as a protest, but as an outrageous act of rebellion and vandalism. King George III and the members of Parliament were absolutely furious. They saw the Boston Tea Party as a direct challenge to their authority and a criminal act that must be punished severely. They couldn't let the colonists get away with destroying so much valuable property belonging to a British company. Their goal was to make an example of Boston, to crush the spirit of resistance there so that no other colony would dare to try something similar. The salty tea in Boston Harbor had sent a message, and Britain was about to send a very harsh one back. Britain's response was swift and severe. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws that the colonists quickly named the Intolerable Acts. These laws were designed specifically to punish Massachusetts and bring the rebellious colony to its knees. One act closed the port of Boston to all trade, which crippled the city's economy. Another act took away much of Massachusetts's power of self-government, placing it more directly under the control of the king. British soldiers were sent in greater numbers, and colonists were forced to house them in their own homes. The British thought these harsh measures would isolate Boston and scare the other colonies into obedience. However, the Intolerable Acts had the opposite effect. Instead of being frightened, the other colonies were outraged. They saw the punishment of Boston as a threat to their own freedoms. If Britain could do this to one colony, it could do it to any of them. The shared threat created a powerful sense of unity that had not existed before. The colonies began to communicate and coordinate with each other more closely than ever. They sent food and supplies to help the people of Boston who were suffering from the port closure. The Intolerable Acts, meant to divide and conquer, ended up binding the colonies together in a common cause. In response to these acts, 12 of the 13 colonies agreed to send delegates to a meeting in Philadelphia in September 1774. This meeting was called the First Continental Congress. It was a momentous step. For the first time, leaders from across the colonies came together to discuss a unified response to British policies. They condemned the Intolerable Acts and called for a boycott of all British goods. They also began to talk more seriously about their rights as Americans and what they needed to do to protect them. The Boston Tea Party had set off a chain reaction that was now leading directly to organized, continent-wide resistance. The Boston Tea Party was, therefore, much more than a protest over tea. It was a pivotal moment that pushed the colonies down the path to revolution. The bold act of defiance in Boston Harbor, followed by Britain's heavy-handed punishment, created an unstoppable momentum. The arguments turned into actions, and the actions led to war. Less than 2 years after the tea was dumped into the harbor, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord, just a few miles outside of Boston. The Boston Tea Party remains a powerful symbol of how a brave stand for freedom, brewed in a harbor one cold night, can change the course of history forever.